I'll now call the meeting to order. Please note that this meeting is being attended by City Council and staff via Zoom teleconference. Thank you for your patience as we continue to navigate city business through this meeting process. City Clerk, will you please take the roll?
Yes, Councilmember Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Sestarcet.
Here.
Councilmember Masalabit.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Vera Papa.
Here.
And Mayor Kalmick.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. It's time for public communications. At this time, members of the public may address the council regarding the item on the City Council agenda. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the council cannot discuss or take action on any items not on the agenda unless authorized by law. Those members of the public wishing to provide comment were asked to send comments via email to the city clerk at gharper@sealbeachca.gov or via the comment icon on the city website at www.sealbeachca.gov/government/agendas, notices, meeting, videos, /council commission meetings before 5:30 p.m. today. Comments provided via email by 5:30 p.m. today were distributed to the City Council and posted on the city website for review by the public. Email comments received after that time will be posted on the city's website and forwarded to the City Council after the meeting. Any documents for review should have been sent to the city clerk prior to the meeting for distribution. Those members of the public wishing to call in can join the Zoom meeting from any electronic device by clicking the following link: https://zoom.us/j/883-727-60100, or they may call in by dialing 1-669-900-9128 #. Those members requesting to speak by phone or on Zoom can unmute by entering *6 when called upon to speak. Once in the meeting, you will be added to the waiting room until the public comment period begins. At that time, the commenter will be allowed to join the meeting to offer their comments. Commenters will be allotted 5 minutes to address the council. The ability to comment will be disabled when your allotted time has expired. City Clerk, do we have any email comments or anyone on the call that wishes to address the council?
We have 5 email comments, including supplemental communication, and there is no one on the call wishing to speak at this time.
Okay, thank you. So now it's time for a public hearing on item A, which is consideration of an amendment to the housing element of the Seal Beach General Plan. And I'll call upon City Manager Ingram for the staff presentation and report.
Thank you, Mayor. This is Alexis Little, Community Development Director, and I am going to present to you. So I'm going to share my screen here.
Gloria, before we move forward, did we finish the public comment portion of the meeting?
Yes, we did.
So I don't know if it was just me that was having connection issues then.
Yes, the mayor has called up on you now to introduce the item.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mayor Kalmick. Before I turn the item over tonight to our Community Development Director, Alexis Little, for the public hearing presentation, I wanted an opportunity to personally thank and commend Alexa for her countless hours of hard work and dedication on the city's behalf to get us to this point in a very challenging process that's, as all of you know, is mandated by state law. Alexa has been immersed in this high priority effort since she was first appointed our new Community Development Director back in November of last year. In addition to her expertise and experience that is invaluable in her leadership of this intense responsibility, Alexa has worked alongside city staff, consultants, and her colleagues in order to put the city in the best position to submit a housing element document that will hopefully be certified by HCD. And I didn't want that significant effort and Alexa's invaluable dedication to this daunting task to go unnoticed tonight. So Alexa, thank you on behalf of the city for all you've done to get us to this point. Having said that, at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to our Community Development Director, Alexa Smittle. Alexa?
Thank you, City Manager, and good evening, Mayor and Council. As Jill mentioned, tonight has been a long time coming, and we are here to consider the adoption of a new housing element. It's one of 8 existing elements in the Seal Beach General Plan. The General Plan is a blueprint for the community's long-term vision for the future. First and foremost, it governs land use decisions, but it may influence all kinds of city policies. As you can see on the slide, we've got 8 existing chapters in the General Plan. The housing element is our focus tonight, and though there are some additional upcoming changes to the General Plan, which are in fact triggered by the housing element update, and those will include an update to the safety element and a drafting of a new environmental justice element later this year. Under state law, jurisdictions go through the housing element update process every 8 years, which is called a cycle, and this is the 6th one. The process itself is a couple of years long from the start of the state's process all the way to adoption at the local level, which is where we are this evening. This cycle is unlike any of its predecessors. The state has spent the last 5 years passing dozens of housing-related bills intending to address the state's housing crisis. Most of the bills are aimed at increasing the volume of housing, so just more numbers. This is under the basic economic principle of supply and demand, so that if supply goes up, then pricing will come down. It's hard for us to look around and find evidence that this is working right now. We know from within our regional housing market, costs are not declining. They're not even leveling out at this point, but the state's argument is that housing production continues to be too low in volume, despite the housing bills that have come online in the last few years. And this is a driving factor in this unique situation that is this 6th cycle of the housing element. The State Department of Housing and Community Development, which I'll refer to as HCD for this presentation, has interpreted the new laws and their impact on this housing element cycle. And suffice to say, it's been really challenging for jurisdictions to figure out how to work within the new legislation, which often lacks clarity, to work with HCD staff, and to get an outcome that's ideally acceptable to everyone, because not every city, it's not enough that the city adopts the housing element. The HCD must also deem it to have met their standard of the law, and this process is called certification. So what happens if we don't have a certified housing element? There is a higher risk of litigation. HCD themselves will refer us to the Attorney General for prosecution. We can lose certain rights on land use decisions, and we can lose access to grant funding. And this last one is pretty critical. Our back of the envelope guess is that we'd be looking at potentially up to $2 million a year in grant funds that would be at risk. Most of those support public works efforts, in addition to some other grants that could become available in the future from time to time. So in other words, having a housing element certified by HCD is critical, not only from a policy perspective, because the housing element is a policy document, but also for day-to-day operations that can be impacted by the certification process. So yes, there are some real challenges with this cycle, and I can assure you communities around the state are sharing in this struggle. However, this is still our housing element. The staff, consultant, and advisory committee teams have worked diligently for the last year to take the hand we've been dealt by the state and put together a policy document that meets the requirements while incorporating community needs and preferences and the feedback we received during the process. So I'd like to go over what the housing element does. The housing element is about creating opportunities for housing. So as you know, the city is not a developer. We do not build housing. Seal Beach does not own land that can be developed. Our role under state law is to find places that housing may be built, to make it easy for developers to get approvals and build, and to do those things in such a way that housing affordable to lower incomes is built, housing for different subsets of the population, such as special needs, is built, and that housing is available without discrimination and without being built in ways that promote segregation or exacerbate socioeconomic challenges. So I'm going to distill all that down. The housing element is about creating A, the sites, and B, the policies to facilitate development for a range of housing. This is the structure of the housing element, and we'll touch on each of these things: the needs assessment, the resources, constraints, and finally the action plan, which is really where the rubber hits the road of this document. So as you saw in the document, there's a lot of data and discussions on conditions that all ultimately lead to the action plan at the end, which is where and how we facilitate housing development. Some of the salient points from the data assessment is that Seal Beach population has been pretty stable with very little growth in the last 2 decades. Households experience pretty minimal overcrowding conditions, and this is likely due in part to most residents owning their home, where you typically experience less overcrowding conditions. Seal Beach is, not surprisingly, a high-cost housing area, like most Southern California coastal areas, and there are indeed cost-burdened households. Cost burden is a key issue for the state, coming back to the idea that if we increase the supply, the costs of housing will stratify and more affordable rent levels will become available. Within the element, programs like rezoning to create additional housing development is one of the ways this issue is addressed. About 34% of residents live with some type of disability, and while the data does not distinguish disability by age, it can be inferred that a large number of seniors in the leisure world contribute to this proportional share. And the element programs to address this include continued use of CDBG funds, for example, for aging in place bathroom renovations. So every time throughout the document, when we're looking at the needs and we're looking at obstacles, at the end of the document with the action plan is where those things get addressed. The needs assessment section ends with the regional housing needs assessment, or the RHNA, and this process is conducted with each cycle. HCD gives a total housing unit number to SCAG as our regional planning organization, and then SCAG develops the methodology that allocates the units among the different jurisdictions. This cycle was contentious. One of the big changes that occurred at the state level was determined that in this cycle, the total number of units was not just to accommodate forecasted growth, as it's been in the past, but also to accommodate existing demand. And this is a primary factor for why the total number of units is so much higher this year. SCAG's methodology for allocating the units changes with each cycle, and it must be approved by HCD. This cycle's methodology includes consideration for household growth, transit corridors, access to jobs within a 30-minute commute, and includes an equity adjustment factor that functions to reduce the amount of low-income housing that's placed in already low-income areas. Ultimately, SCAG assigns a unit count by income category to each jurisdiction using the adopted HCD-approved methodology. This chart shows the number of units assigned to Seal Beach in the prior cycles and the total number that has to be allocated in our share of it. So bear in mind, the assignment methodology varies with each cycle. So we can't really look at it as an apples to apples comparison, but you can see that the numbers were dramatically higher in this cycle than in the prior 2. And this is our unit breakdown by income category, which gets us to that 1,243 total units. And we're going to discuss these income categories just a little bit further so everyone understands what we're talking about. So the law defines income categories based on an area median income, and that's published each year by the state. The current median income for Orange County for a family of 4 is $106,700. So everything that's in this table in front of you here is based off of that standard. So keep in mind, this is a family of 4. So when you're looking at these rents, you want to picture needing to be in at least a 2-bedroom home for these amounts of money. If you're moderate income, you should generally be able to find a housing that's affordable to you. So to find a 2-bedroom unit for $3,200 or maybe a little less, I recently looked, there were a couple in the $2,400 range in a quick search. So at moderate income, you should be able to find housing that's considered affordable. So 30% of your income going towards housing. But if you're low income or below, you're going to have a tough time in Seal Beach, as well as other coastal and urbanized areas. If you look at that extremely low category, $800 for a 2-bedroom unit, and you couldn't find that 20 years ago, you're certainly not going to find it now on the open market. So when we're talking about rents like this at this very low market rate level, what we're really talking about are units with restrictive covenants, meaning there's a deed on how much rent can be charged and the income level the tenant has to be in to live in the unit. Affordable housing with restrictive covenants is most commonly done in a couple of different ways. One is through a partnership between a public agency or agencies and an experienced affordable housing developer that can leverage local assistance with state tax credits and potentially other resources. And these are very complex transactions with multiple underwriters that ultimately reduce the cost of production through favorable loan terms, again, tax credits, vouchers, other resources that can so that lower rents can be applied. Another way is when a market rate developer builds a portion of the units at affordable rates, either of their own volition, it's unusual, but it's not completely unheard of, especially at a moderate income rate, and recent state laws are encouraging this. You also see it through a density bonus project where a developer can, by law, build more units if some of them are affordable. Or if a city has an inclusionary ordinance, Seal Beach does not, but what happens in that circumstance is new units, a certain percentage, are required to be at an affordable level. And the Element Action Plan includes programs that looks to seek and explore these different options for affordable housing development during the 8-year period. Okay, so how does this work, and how does our housing element get to 459 units being built at below market rate? And the answer, pursuant to state law, is simply A, sites, and B, policies. What the law says is that we have to offer pathways to making this work. We need to look at the impediments to housing development and take action to reduce or eliminate them. One of the most important findings the council will make in adopting this element is that housing development can occur, including on sites where there is existing development, because the sites and the policies contained in this housing element will adequately facilitate development. This is the key task that staff, consultants, stakeholders, advisory groups, and this council have been working towards throughout this process. And that has been done by giving painstaking consideration to what the assets are that different sites have, like access to transit, schools, utilities, and amenities that people want to live near, by spreading development throughout different districts and neighborhoods, and creating policies that remove barriers, just like zoning that doesn't allow for housing, and therefore ultimately allowing the council to say that the combination of the sites, the policies, and the private market will meet the goals of the housing element. If production falls short of these RHNA allocations, then additional permit streamlining conditions can be imposed for certain types of housing projects. The state has also given us guidance on how we can demonstrate that our sites will foster development of affordable units, and the answer is density. Theoretically, the higher the density, the greater the economy of scale, and therefore development is more likely to be able to accommodate low income or below market rate units in its financial model. As a city with less than 25,000, that standard is a minimum of 20 units per acre with 30 preferred. And there's also a formula for counting accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as affordable, even though those units most likely will not have covenants on them. The state is allowing jurisdictions to say that some ADUs are by default affordable. Resources and opportunities section of this document is summarized here, and simply put, it's land and rezoning. These are the primary resources that the city has to offer. Certain grant programs like CDBG or tax credits, other grants and resources do sometimes come up from time to time that could be leveraged in partnership for a low-income housing development or improvements to existing housing. And sometimes there are other ways to bring costs down for development, which again theoretically makes inclusion of affordable units more palatable to a developer if they can offset costs. These are the primary constraints that are discussed, but not all of them. And yes, the state essentially says that zoning is a constraint for development. However, realistically, the biggest challenges to housing development in Seal Beach are, one, the Coastal Commission, who has a very different outlook on housing than HCD, and two, the cost of land and development, and the city has no control over these things. Fair housing is included in the constraint section, and as you saw in the document, quite a bit of information has been added since the last draft based on HCD's advice and what other communities were doing. And at the end of the day, the point of the information is to make sure that the sites and policies implemented in the housing element are not doing anything to exacerbate discrimination or segregation. One obvious example would be to look at a city like Long Beach, where you can identify census tracts that are primarily people of color or tracts with high poverty rates. HCD does not want to see cities placing all of their lower income housing sites into areas that are already low resource. So what the research found and is presented in the document is that Seal Beach doesn't have these same types of clusters. Nevertheless, it's important to make sure that our sites, especially those intended to accommodate lower income units, are not intentionally kept away from high resource areas. This is a summary of the policy groups that are included in that action plan, and we've been touching on these as we've been going over the last few slides. So as discussed, we will need to rezone several sites to accommodate the RHNA housing unit allocation. Rezoning includes developing the rules and regulations for the sites through the creation of a new zone or zones for mixed use. The rezoning process will also need to consider other factors within the land use controls that may deter development. Rezoning is a very public process. This won't happen overnight. It will include outreach and consultation with other entities. Several programs discuss improved coordination with regional groups for sharing of resources, as well as providing more information to developers and performing better evaluations of programs in order to make adjustments as time goes on if needed. The County of Orange is an important player in affordable housing, as well as our CDBG housing improvement program that takes place in Leisure World. Partnerships may also be considered with housing trusts or strengthened relationships with a number of other groups that operate in the housing arena. And as you know, the city is drafting a local coastal plan, and this action is included as a program to help address the constraint identified of Coastal Commission review. Coastal rules are still going to be coastal rules. We can't change that with an LCP, but ideally the process can potentially be a little faster for applicants, reducing their time and incentivizing them by saving money for a time reduction that would offset the cost of housing, potentially fostering more affordable housing development. Two versions of the housing element were provided to you in tonight's packet. There's a clean version with minor track changes that followed the Planning Commission meeting a couple weeks ago, and a very redlined version that identified the changes made since you saw this document last September. The redline document illustrates the changes that followed the receipt of comments from HCD that we received on November 19th of last year. And as you can see, quite a bit of work went into the revisions between that date and January 6th when the revised document was posted. We updated our discussions on prior programs. We better fleshed out more of the programs to address HCD concerns about obstacles to development, provided more discussion on the sites selected for rezoning, provided additional data on populations and housing payments. So we substantially increased the fair housing analysis and augmented text for clarity in a number of other places. Following the Planning Commission meeting, some additional revisions were made. The most notable is a change in the language regarding how the Leisure World site was presented for potential additional development. The previous version discussed redevelopment of carport areas, and while this is not impossible, there certainly could qualify as underutilized areas of the site as a whole. The unique ownership pattern of Leisure World led the Planning Commission to approve new language that identifies areas used for community amenities for redevelopment, which could be a simpler process. Some other minor edits were identified by the Planning Commission as well as by staff while making revisions to the document after the meeting, and these changes are footnoted. I will note that table B-3 in the appendix had some incorrect formulas running in the Excel form and has been updated to reflect the accurate numbers. Specifically, the prior version identified a total of 1,549 sites, and the number should have been 1,557 sites, inclusive of a limited number of accessory dwelling units. As you'll recall, the city's RHNA allocation is 1,243. However, we must include a buffer and assume that not all sites will develop to the capacity identified in the housing element. So that's why our allocation is that 1,243 number, but we've identified 1,557 sites. Which brings us to our discussion on the identified sites for housing development. The sites currently zoned for housing are not adequate to accommodate the RHNA allocation, therefore new sites have to be identified. As you know, there was a committee that convened in the spring of 2021. I think a couple of the council members were included in that to provide recommendations and work through the process with staff on ideas for these sites. Staff additionally did additional outreach to the property owners to discuss the housing element process and where the city needs to go in order to have a certified housing element. As we reviewed the selected sites, I want to make a couple things very clear. The first is that adopting the housing element does not approve development. There is a public rezoning process first, and after that time, any applications would be processed just like they are now through the planning, building, environmental, and where required coastal commission process. We will be initiating the rezoning as quickly as possible. New legislation has implemented new penalties for not having a certified housing element, and that is that rezoning must be done by October of this year. Given the fact pattern from HCD responses to other communities, it's possible HCD will not certify this housing element despite all our efforts. As we discussed earlier, there are some serious consequences for communities without a housing element. Therefore, we must move forward to demonstrate our desire to comply with state law and our willingness to work collaboratively with HCD through this process. Now, realistically, it's not possible for us to complete a rezoning effort along with the environmental impact report that's going to be required in order to do that by October. However, we will be able to show that we are making a good faith effort, again, in the event we do not receive certification from HCD. And secondly, I also want to reiterate that the housing element is a living document. The city must maintain these adequate sites to accommodate the RHNA of the entire 8-year cycle. That means if some sites develop with housing, but not at the density or size anticipated, new sites have to be identified. It's a zero-sum game. So in other words, the efforts made to identify the sites were very carefully considered throughout this year, so that if 1 or 2 of them developed well below expectations, then others are already available to accommodate the unit count, and that's what that buffer is for. Otherwise, we could be in a situation where we'd be continually amending the element throughout the cycle. This is a very quick snapshot of the different sites that are identified and how we got to that 1,557 number. I'll go through the sites individually here. And the council has seen these sites before. There's no surprises in here. And also, please note, they're not in any kind of order here. This is just a list. And again, we are relying on the private market to develop. So their financial performance and their ability to develop housing at these sites will be making those decisions. The city is not prioritizing one of these over the other. This is the Shops at Rossmore. And like most of the sites, we are talking about densification of a site where housing would be implemented in addition to commercial uses, which is why rezoning efforts are expected to be for mixed use zones. The same thing at the Old Ranch Town Center, where a portion of the parking could potentially be reconfigured for housing development. So areas of the Old Ranch Country Club that could be utilized differently. Seal Beach Plaza, again, with potential for incorporating mixed use to include housing. The Leisure World site, which is of course already a residential development, and what is proposed is consideration for converting those common areas into additional housing developments, likely very similar to the condominium towers that are built there now, that exist there now. Accurate Storage is in fact already zoned for housing. What's being proposed is a higher density designation. This would be conversion of what is primarily outdoor boat storage, along with some parking, into housing. The Navy has initiated a process to solicit input and proposals from developers for this site, and they are looking at a long-term land lease and potentially mixed-use development for the site. The Seal Beach Center, again, potentially some reconfiguration or different use of some of those parking areas. The Main Street specific plan area, again, some densification, looking to add in about 40 units within these different sites that are identified. And 99 Marina Drive, which is a former oil extraction property and currently vacant there, at least the northern portion. Staff's recommendation, as well as the Planning Commission's recommendation, is that the City Council adopt the housing element. The statutory deadline for submittal to HCD is February 12th, and HCD then has 90 days to review the document. Meanwhile, staff has submitted the draft to the Airport Land Use Commission for consideration for consistency with the airport environment's land use plan. And staff will also be initiating the zoning code update as well as the safety element update and the environmental justice element process, and all of these things being tied to this housing element update, which is the trigger. And with that, I am available for questions. We also have other team members here. We have Art Bashmakian, who is our interim senior planner, available, as well as our consultant, John Douglas. Stop sharing my screen.
Mayor Kalmick, back to you.
Okay, do we have any questions from council, please?
I have one question.
Sure, go ahead, Tom.
I didn't see the Boeing area on here. What was that looked at, and why is that not a part of this? Like the parking lot?
My understanding is that it was looked at, and the property owners were not interested in continuing to participate through this process. So at the moment, it's not included in our inventory.
So the shops at Rossmore property owners are okay with looking at something?
Yes, that is my understanding.
Okay, all right, thanks.
You know, the council comments or questions?
I do. I have a question.
Go ahead, Sandra.
I may have missed it, which I probably did. It's in the housing element, but the population categories, were they based on a 2020 preliminary census data, or is it the old data?
Different pieces of data were used. So the citations, I think, do reference, but some of them are absolutely estimates from the American Community Survey. John, do you have some input on that? I know that that was a section that you worked extensively on.
Yes, Mayor and Council. I'm looking in the document right now to see what the citation is. It was the most recent available census data at the time, but off the top of my head, I don't remember if that was 2020 decennial census.
Well, that might affect some of the numbers in the document. I know that the housing element is historically not in line with the housing elements as they've been required over the years. So I thought maybe because the census data should be coming out or came out already, that whatever that data is needed to be in the most recent housing element. Anyway, you can clarify that for me at some point.
Councilmember,
You know what? I was really struck by some of the census data that there are a lot more women in this town than there are men in all the age categories. What's up with that? And I think it's unusual that 75% of the units in this town are owner occupied. The county seems to be 53%, and I'm thinking that it's around 45 to 55% everywhere else. And I think owner occupancy is really high here. I was surprised to see that there aren't more rental units than there are. I'm not going to comment on the individual sites, but I think that while the Boeing property looks on the face of it pretty much like a good spot to put some housing, and I would tend to agree with that. But I think that there are issues with Boeing, like top secret issues that we need to be sensitive to. And I think that might be part of the reason why they're off the list. And I guess I understand their sensitivity to putting people in their parking lot so close to some of their work stations that they don't want to be close to people. In terms, well, I'm not going to mention any others, but I thought I'd just throw those 2 cents in on the Boeing site. And that's about all the questions I had written down while I was reading it. And I know there are others that will come up, but for the time being, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from council?
I had a quick question. I noticed on the pavilion site, there were 120 designated residential units. Is that correct? Alexa?
Well, I'm pulling up the page. Sorry, I don't have them memorized.
And then Marina was 90 or 99?
The 99 Marina Drive is at 86 units.
86. Yeah. And then Pavilions is how many?
Sorry,
I thought it was 120. Well, you can go back in the slides.
yeah, there we go. 120. Yes.
How was that determined? Because it seems like, I mean, I'm just looking at it non-scientifically, but the empty lot would maybe have higher density than a place that has offices and buildings and storefronts and stuff. How are those units determined, to get 120 where there's an existing facility versus an empty lot that has nothing? And they're kind of the same size, maybe a little bit smaller, but what type of units are we looking at each of those locations to come up with 120 at one and 90 or 86 at the other?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The analysis that was done was definitely given thought as to the type of development that may make some sense at those sites. So for the 99 Marina Drive, there was conversation regarding the surrounding environment there, the types of uses that were there already. So the number chosen was at that lower density of 20 dwelling units per acre because it fit into the context of the development that existed, going from kind of lower density on that southern or southeastern side of it to across the street to a higher density environment. And for the pavilion site, I think the idea is that there would still continue to be some commercial development on the site, that it would change into a mixed use site. So instead of just maybe having something like a condo like you might see on Marina Drive, you might have more apartments or types of things stacked above commercial. So that's I believe where the thought process was going, that some of these sites would have a little bit more of an urbanized feel, whereas Marina in particular would have kind of a lower density associated with it comparatively.
And would that have a height restriction? Or is that a multi-story facility? Or is that just one extra story on top of the existing building, say, theoretically?
Well, and that is what the rezoning process would be looking at is creating all those rules and regulations.
Because right now we have a height limitation, right, in the city.
Mhm.
And then for Main Street, how do you come up with 40? Because if you double decked every unit on that street, hypothetically, I'm not advocating that at all, but is that just at certain locations or certain blocks, or how does that number come up?
I believe that was really truly just a reasonable assessment of, okay, this is what could be done. This is what could reasonably be expected to happen. And I, believe that a lot of it would really probably be much, pretty small units. So you'd be, you're not looking at, adding a 1,800 square foot unit down there. You're looking at much smaller numbers to, accommodate that type of growth in a small area. And again, John,
Okay.
if you have any comments to share on that too, from the process that you experienced, I'd welcome this.
Yes, I believe that there were just a few of the portions of the Main Street area that were the focus of that, assuming that development would not occur in the majority of the area. But for example, some parking lots that are underutilized where development could be concentrated.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay. My question with kind of picking back on what Councilmember Verapapa asked, specifically in terms of the comments that were received initially, from HCD regarding, the first attempt, did they, in some of their questioning of, can you really do this or show us, did Main Street, was that questioned at all as to how you were going to reasonably assume that you could get those units on Main Street?
I don't believe they questioned Main Street in particular.
Okay.
For the most part, their questioning was really aimed at, in general, they want the housing element to show that it's reasonable to assume development will occur in these locations.
Okay. And so they were really honing in on wanting more specifics, and I assume.
Wanting more specifics and just, what you're hearing from, or what I'm hearing from listening to peers going through this process in other places is, they're looking for, something bordering a guarantee that housing will develop. And obviously that's not something we can offer. We're not building the housing. We don't own the land.
Yeah. I mean, I can report that I've participated in several mayors meetings of different types, and the issue of certifying and getting a certified housing element was brought up in several cases. And the response that I heard from everybody was like, you can't see it, but everyone's throwing their hands up in the air. So this is, I can only reinforce what our development director has stated, that this is a really daunting process. And I think that, we have to rely on her department's ability to get us through this. And so I think we all have to be open-minded and cooperative when it comes to, well, I don't want 120 units at the pavilion's site, or I don't want units in any other particular site. I think this is something that we have to, kind of back our community development department and get a certified housing element. And then down the road, when it comes time to see what and where we want to develop, that's the time, to have the debates and arguments and so forth about what. Thank you. So I will now, any last chance for council
And
member comments?
I do. I've got some comments. So
Oh, good. Okay, Shelley.
I'm
Go
gonna
ahead.
go through 'em. I will chime in and say what I've said for every meeting. I have problems with Old Ranch Country Club being considered as eligible, suitable housing site. In Appendix B, it says that the existing golf course will not impede housing development. And while that may be true, there is no mention that there's an existing legal agreement, a restriction on development that remains in place from the Bixby project for 8 more years till September 22nd, 2029. So I personally don't consider that this is legally available for development. This agreement was made as a promise to the residents living around the base who were opposed to the massive Bixby development that took away almost all open space north of the freeway except for the golf course, that nothing more would happen, at least for a long time. This also acted to protect the base's flight path from further encroachment. A new owner purchased the golf club in 2006, fully aware of the development restriction. After the Bixby development, the 2003 update of the general plan stated in it as a goal in its land use element to discourage further encroachment into the flight path of the JFTB. I did send an email. I don't know if they were distributed or not. I don't seem to have anything, but showing what the current flight path is on the JFTB southern exposure on the golf course. And it is more than just what the noise contours show. Much of the aircraft at the JFTB are helicopters. However, there are a number of fixed wing aircraft, and while a lot of the helicopters fly southward across the driving range, fixed wing aircraft fly across the golf course towards Seal Beach Boulevard. There is a turn southward in the flight path, but the larger aircraft have difficulty making this turn, and many fly near the maintenance sheds or straight out. Placing housing, which is a sensitive use, under active military flight path would subject for future residents to noise and an increased risk of accident. And these would be my constituents, presumably, so I have problems with that. Our old housing unit, the 2013-2021 housing element, said that they would direct the construction of low and moderate income housing to sites that are minimally impacted by noise, flooding, or other environmental constraints. I don't believe that we should place our seniors, low income, disabled, whoever they are, any residents that close to daily flight operations on the JFTB with the noise that goes along with it and an increased risk of accident. The Joint Forces Training Base is located in another city, but its aircraft fly over Seal Beach when using the southern departure. The JFTB is the last military air base in LA and Orange counties and acts as our emergency operations center in the event of natural disaster for the whole region. So we should care about it. It serves as a training base for both military and civilian aircraft. It's the southern headquarters of Cal OES, home to the state's Mediterranean fruit fly sterilization program, which is important to agriculture. It's used for possible deployments, occasionally Air Force One, also the Great Pacific Air Show, and starting, I think, tomorrow, Super Bowl aircraft will show up and will be noticeable up there. Future encroachment might jeopardize the operational integrity of the airfield. Aircraft are instructed not to fly over residential areas. Building additional residential near the runway would further act to restrict the flights out of the base. when the jets left NES Los Alamitos and it became the FRC, a noise study was done in 1987, used for the AQs, which is an airport installation. Oh geez, I'm forgetting all the names right now, but that was done in 1994, which studies noise and compatibility. At this time, air traffic was mostly helicopters, and the base was allowed to use Air Force standards to shorten their crash and safety zones, pulling them back onto base property because they had 10 to 25 aircraft operations per day per runway. The present use has increased with the addition of other aircraft, both helicopters and fixed wing. We have Blackhawks, Cessnas, firefighting aircraft that have come in just recent years. In 2016, the Orange County Airport Land Use Commission was doing an update to the JFTB ALUP, the Airport Environment's Land Use Plan. Caltrans Aeronautics Division responded to this, saying that the agency felt that due to current number of aircraft operations, 126 per day, they would strongly recommend at least 3 safety zones or more due to the flight path not being straight out. This, however, would require a new AQ study, which is expensive, and the base did not follow through. This does not mean what is present is adequate. Caltrans Aeronautics states that basing this draft's ALUP's noise policies, maps, and contours on data originally obtained in 1987 is not suitable, and we highly encourage renewed efforts to update this data, thus resulting in new current noise policies, contours, and maps that more accurately reflect the actual aeronautical noise effects that exist due to the Joint Forces Los Alamitos. They also state the division greatly encourages the Airport Land Use Commission to develop safety zone policies and maps that reflect the actual traffic patterns used based on accurate operational data for the runways at Joint Forces Los Alamitos. This is to protect against future incompatible land uses being developed and to minimize possible safety uses. And this is based on the California Airport Land Use Handbook. The Orange County Airport Land Use sent a letter to all Orange County cities within airport influence areas in April and May to have them submit their housing element to the ALUC for review between the Planning Commission and City Council approvals. Seal Beach did not do this, so we do not yet have any opinion on compatibility with airport operations. Approving this site by the City Council before the ALUC is not proper procedure, and I cannot approve a site for inclusion in a zone change without that ALUC review. Saying that this will come later does not seem adequate to me. This property has other considerations, traffic impacts close, Lamson close to Seal Beach Boulevard, which is already, I think, I don't know, they don't use LOS anymore, but it was like a D. Old Ranch serves as a retarding basin for drainage from CPE, and it's the location of hundreds of trees that were placed as mitigation in the Bixby project and now are somewhere on the site, and I'm not sure anyone knows where. In conclusion, at this time, I cannot find that the Old Ranch Country Club site is either available or suitable for residential zoning, and I do not support its inclusion in the 6th cycle element, and I ask that this site be removed. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. Any other comments from council?
Could
Can I just suggest to make sure, I didn't know Councilmember Starsek was going to go to her position on the issue. Could we just make sure that public hearing is open to receive the evidence that she provided during her statement?
Sure. Was there another comment that I heard?
Yeah, could we get staff's response to some of those concerns?
Certainly. Thank you, Councilmember Thompson. With regards to the restriction on development, that is correct. There is a development agreement for that site. And I'll ask the city attorney to correct me if I'm wrong, that is a discretionary action of the city council, just like rezoning would be. So it would be possible for the council to change direction on that, just as they'll be changing direction on the zoning for some of these sites. Yeah, and absolutely there are impacts associated with development in all places. And that does need to be considered from an environmental perspective. And certainly traffic is always a big topic when we're talking about development. And that is something that will be considered through the EIR process as we get to the rezoning. It is a full environmental impact report, and a traffic assessment will accompany that. In addition to, additional traffic assessments that may need to come up depending on the types of development that happen over time, just as a part of our normal application process as we review these developments. With regards to the Airport Land Use Commission, yes, Councilmember Starsik did provide a number of documents this afternoon that I have not had a chance to analyze. We did take a look at the environs land use plan that exists. And that was considered when those sites were selected for the country club site to be out of the 60 decibel or to be out of the 65 decibel noise contour line. There's additional information that that has been shared for the council to consider. Staff was not able to, we're looking at the documents that we have, and that's the existing land use plan that's associated with the airport. And with regards to submit, I'm sorry.
Mayor, if I could.
Yes, go ahead, City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Alexa, if you could, just in all fairness to staff and follow up to Council Member Sostarsik's comments, since we did have conversation with her previously about the timing of our housing element document review, along with our timing with the Planning Commission public hearing, the council public hearing, and trying to get on an airport land use meeting. Could you just talk to that point so that the rest of the council has a knowledge of that as well? I think in all fairness to staff, it would be appropriate to mention.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, I mean, the fact is there just was not enough time. By the time we heard back from the state and being able to turn the document around and address the pages of comments that they provided to us. We did in fact submit to ALUC in between the Planning Commission and the City Council. There just wasn't an ALUC meeting in between the Planning Commission and the City Council. So we just have a lot of constraints with this document that really weren't working in our favor, quite frankly.
I have a question, Alexa. If we were to no longer consider the Old Ranch site, which is listed at up to 120 units, where would we have to go to find enough potential units to have our housing element certified?
The number that we kind of need to get to, which is, a little bit of it's HCD's recommendation to have that buffer of about 20% above our existing arena allocation. So that number for us is really to have 1,492 unit sites available. If we take out the site, yes, we do need to put those units elsewhere.
Somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And time-wise, to even consider doing that, I mean, is that going to put us, into being in arrears on our obligation to get this turned in?
The document statutorily needs to be delivered to HCD by the 12th, and today is the 7th. So yeah, that would be challenging unless the council wanted to make a decision tonight. But again, I can tell you that the history of this document was was to try to make reasonable assessments of the development capacity for these sites, something that would be defensible, something that could be explained to HCD as needed. So it certainly wouldn't be a decision that I would recommend making lightly.
Yeah. I mean, I totally understand Councilmember Sostarsik's argument or her view of whether or not this should be included. But for the purposes that we're here for tonight, I mean, I could probably raise almost the same number of questions about the US Navy site, regarding traffic at Seal Beach Boulevard and Pacific Coast Highway. What kind of access they're going to be? We've got the same aircraft, taking off from Los Al, flying directly over that location. Sea level rise. I mean, I can think of all kinds of things that could potentially throw a monkey wrench into wanting to consider that site. And, it almost applies. I don't see too many sites, with the exception of the 99 Marina, which is a vacant lot, that, we can say, yeah, let's go ahead and plan for that, because we are going to plan for that, whether they be condos or homes or a laundromat. I mean, that's part of what you do with empty property. I think any of the other properties that we're considering, all have people that are not going to want it. But that's part of the whole process of deciding what's best for the city as a whole. And where, if the circumstances were different, I might say, well, yeah, let's stop and take a harder look at this site at Old Ranch. But under the circumstances of trying to get a certified housing element, which is not enforcing or putting us in a position of having to actually build anything, I think we really need to go ahead and continue with the certification process and submit this. Anyone else?
Yeah, could I just add
Yeah,
to that?
just to,
But Mayor,
Go ahead.
before we get into the council members' opinions on the issue, could we just reconfirm that there are no further public comments? And for the record, the email that Councilmember Sostarczyk mentioned was distributed to council members. That would be part of the record, as well as 3 or 4 other emails that came in earlier in the day. So can we just verify that there's no further public comment and
Sure.
close the public
Okay.
hearing?
Then I'll open the public hearing. And City Clerk, do we have any members of the public that are on the call that are wishing to speak?
No, Mayor, there's no one on the call wishing to speak.
Okay, thank you. Then I will go ahead and close the public hearing.
Thank you.
And now, are there any additional council member questions and concerns?
I was going to comment on the timing of this again, and I think it goes to what you were saying about we're up against the wall and we really need to certify this. But the certification isn't going to be a certification because HCD is probably going to make enough substantial comments about the document and how we will need to modify it in some way so that the ultimate adoption will once again be on the table and up for a public hearing. So I think that adopting it tonight and sending it off starts that clock. And we might be a little closer to getting to what their ultimate comments are going to be. That's all.
Thank you. Councilmember Verapop, did you have something you were going to add?
no, I think it was answered, and I
concur with you and Sandra on that. I think that we're not doing any rezoning at this time. We're just going through this first exercise, if you will. So I think it's important that we move on and consider it and move forward. Thank you.
Okay. Last chance. Any other council member comments?
Mayor, I think we ought to clarify, just so everybody's on the same page, that this has been to HCD once. This draft does reflect staff's best effort to address the comments that HCD made in the process. Your letter, the HCD letter is in your packet. So I just want to emphasize that although it's likely that there will be more back and forth with HCD as well as other agencies, we do have a document before you for adoption that responds to the first round of extensive comments from HCD. So I don't want anybody to be confused about where we are in that process.
Very good. Thank you, Craig. All right, then. I'm ready now to call for a motion and a second.
I will move that we adopt the amended housing element of the Seal Beach General Plan for 21 to 29 planning period and determine the project is exempt from CEQA.
All right, thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. We'll now call for the vote. City Clerk?
Yes. Councilmember Masalabin, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Vera Papa, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councilmember Moore, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councilmember Sistarsik, how do you vote?
No.
Mayor Kalmek, how do you vote?
Yes. That passes 4-1. All right, then. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight and paying attention and being involved. And I will now adjourn the City Council to Mondays, February 14th, 2022 at 5:30 p.m. to meet in closed session if deemed necessary. So everyone have a nice evening and a nice week. Good night.
Good night.